spent they just cooked with, now called spent grains, because they're spent, of course, from the liquid they just cooked up, known as wort. Wort is spelled W-O-R-T. It's a very thick, amber-colored, sugar-rich substance. All that wort is going to be strained out of the latter times, but after all that wort strained out, what's going to be left over is the spent grain. Now, we don't just throw that away. Anheuser-Busch actually recycles 99.4% of the solid byproduct that's left over from brewing beer. One of those examples is after that wort's out of the latter times, our brewers are going to take the spent grain right out of those tanks, store them in the back of our breweries where they are actually dried and sold as cattle feed. Between all 12 of our breweries, we account for 4% of the nation's cattle feed by doing this process. We've been doing it for over 100 years since Adolphus Busch had been with the company. Now, it's going to take a little over an hour for that wort to be strained out of the latter times, and the wort will then go into one of those two brew kettles located right behind that fire extinguisher. Inside there, that wort's going to come to a boil, and as the wort comes to a boil, our brewer is going to add the hops in 3 stages. After all the hops are added with that wort, the wort and the hops are going to cook for 2 hours. After that 2 hours, before the wort leaves those tanks to go to an alpha fermenter tank in the next stage of the brewing process known as primary fermentation, the wort's actually going to go through what's called whirlpooling, whereas that wort is swirled around, making like a whirlpool, of course, and that's going to drag down a large majority of all that sediment that's got in there from the cooking process in here. So when they take the wort out, this is the least amount of sediment as possible. So, from beginning to finish in this room, it's going to take about 5 hours to cook up a batch of wort. Now, a little bit of side information, the unit of measurement of beer is known as a barrel. A barrel is equal to 2 kegs or 31 gallons. So if you get a keg for your cookouts this summer or whatever, that's 15.5 gallons of beer. In this room alone, our brewers will cook up approximately 68,000 barrels in a single week. Any questions for me before we continue? Alright, so if you will, follow me. We're going to head, yes? On the roof? No. No, nothing up there but roof. If you guys will follow me, we're going to head over to primary fermentation where it's going to drop to 50 degrees.
Oh god.
50 is not really that cold.
Still, it's going to be like 90 to 50. So, they're going to 90 degrees and to 50.
It's not that cold though. 50 is warm.
Put your jackets back on.
Oh, it smells like beer. Oh, smell. Oh. It smells like really gross. So it's 50 degrees in here, and the other room was 80 to 90 degrees, so it got cold. Yes. Move. It feels good though. I'm not even cold. Move, midget. Oh.
Alright, so right over here we're going to talk about that next stage in the brewing process known as primary fermentation. We're going to focus on these tanks right over here that I'm pointing to right across from the wall. These are known as alpha fermenter tanks. We have 35 of these tanks between this floor and the 2 floors above. Now, before the wort goes into these tanks, you got to know that wort is a very fragile substance. If it goes from a warm temperature to a cooler temperature very quickly, that sudden change in temperature can shock the wort. By shocking the wort, the fermentable and non-fermentable sugars are destroyed, and the wort cannot be turned into beer. So that's a bad thing, of course. Think of it as like jumping into a cold pool on a hot day. Now, to prevent that from happening, you're going to see a rib cage-like design around these tanks. Those are actually heating coils. So they'll warm up the tanks, allowing the wort to get in there safely, making cool it down, avoiding shocking of that wort. Then it'll also maintain the temperature of this room. Now, at this point, our brewers are going to add our famous strain of Budweiser yeast. And for those who don't know, yeast is a living thing and it loves to eat sugar. So as the yeast consumes the fermentable and non-fermentable sugars, it's going to create 3 things: alcohol, carbonation, and more yeast. As the wort stays in here for a week, it's going to allow that process to happen. And then after that week of staying in this tank, the wort is now technically beer. It has all the properties of a beer, but it's not going to be carbonated enough. It's going to be a little too sweet, and it's definitely not a Budweiser because it hasn't been through our next stage in the brewing process, known as beechwood aging. We're going to talk about beechwood aging downstairs. But before we go down there, Just gotta make sure. Okay, there is some tanks behind me. If you look straight down the hallway, you're gonna see some cylindrical tanks on wheels. These are known as Beechwood torpedoes. They are essentially measurement scoops for our Beechwood ships, and they're gonna fill up 3 of those for 1 lager tank. Like I said earlier, we're gonna talk about what happens to those when we go downstairs. So are there any questions for me on primary fermentation before we head down? All right. Well, if there's no questions, if you need any elevator assistance, again, Julian's right in the back of the line. There she is waving. Around the corner is the elevator as well as the stairs. Looks like they sprayed down the floors recently, so please do watch your steps and also use the handrails if you're going down the stairs. So follow me.